I just have a couple questions for you, and I promise I'm not going to take up too much of your time. All of my questions are about the mystery of the exploding teeth, first off, just to put them in context. And the first one I wanted to ask, I know at the beginning of your book, you talk a bit about how you found all your cases to talk about throughout the book, but I'm curious, like, were there different archives you were using, or just kind of like how did you come about all of these cases that you found?
Do you mean in terms of, where to look for them? Or,
Yes.
well, I mean, the thing is that one of the great things about the medical literature, the early medical literature in particular, is that a huge amount of it has been digitized. So, I mean, medical journals got going in a big way in the late 18th century, kind of around 1800. You see this big surge in the number of journals being published over Europe in particular. And then the American journals come along a bit late, 1820s, 1830s, and most of those early journals are now online. And actually, one of the things I found when I first got into the idea of collecting these medical curiosities is that every time I would look for a kind of legitimate article I needed to look at for the previous book I was writing, I'd find one of these little curiosities kind of on the next page. So they're dotted around. They're quite frequent, particularly in the earlier journals. So actually, it was only a matter generally of just kind of taking a journal at random and flicking through the pages and seeing what I found. And then a bit later, when I'd used a lot of the easy ones to find, I found there are certain sort of keywords you can search for, which will give you a load of cases about people who've swallowed unusual things or had unusual accidents. So and it's a huge kind of body of work. There are a lot of these journals, and most of them, certainly all the big journals, have been digitized. So you've got, in some cases, I mean, if you look at a journal like the Lancet, which started in the 1820s, every single issue is online.
Okay.
So it's actually, from that point of view, not that difficult to find the cases.
Gotcha. That's really handy, actually. I know your book talks about a lot of really weird cases. What do you personally think is the weirdest case you've come across?
Well, I kind of divide that into two categories, because there are the ones where you think, well, this can't possibly have happened. And I think the weirdest of those is there's this amazing case from 1824, I think, which was in what is now the New England Medical Journal, so leading medical journal, and that is the case of this woman who suffered from a condition which was dubbed by the doctor who reported it paruria erratica, which means wandering disorder of urine. And the thing that's really the one thing I find really amazing about this case is it's so detailed. It's based on first-hand accounts of several doctors and other people who had observed the patient. I don't know if you remember that one, but it's about the woman who started to spout urine from all these different orifices. And the thing that I find so interesting about it is how well observed it seems to have been. There's this amazing long document at the end. He pens this kind of data table where he outlines where the urine was coming from, on what day and at what time of day. So she was obviously observed very closely. But there's no really plausible physiological explanation for it.
I was just going to say, I thought your explanation seemed to justify in some sense what you could make of the case in a sense, but correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I mean, the explanation at the end is just a kind of, it's more of a fun little intellectual exercise. It's a nice little kind of Dr. House style bit of obscure diagnosis. I don't think it's genuinely plausible, actually. I mean, I inserted that, I put that in mainly just to say, look, things that you think sound just completely out there sometimes can happen. There can be a reason for these things. I mean, I think there are too many elements in that story that just don't add up for it to be genuinely the explanation. I suspect if you want to kind of find a nuts and bolts explanation for it, there was probably something going on there. She no doubt she did have a prolapsed uterus and a prolapsed bladder. And there were probably some elements of those symptoms probably did manifest, but I think the more extreme ones were, an exaggeration or, element of deception. Maybe she had Munchausen's or something, a factitious disorder that meant that she craved the attention of these doctors.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And you said there were two types of weird cases. What is the other type?
Yeah, I suppose the other type is the one that is actually genuine. So, in fact, I don't think it's in the book, but there's a case that I quite like about a woman who developed, I think it was black sweat, and actually it was a case of chromodosis, which is a rare genetic disorder, which is actually quite well understood today. And I'm quite interested by these doctors who come across a disorder that's basically never been described before, and they're completely stumped by it. And it's quite interesting watching a physician engage with something they've not seen before, they have no vocabulary for, and certainly no physiological mechanism to explain. And they describe what they see. So I like seeing those with the modern eyes, where you do actually have an idea of how it would be diagnosed today and how it's understood. And there are lots of those. I'm struggling to think of another example. I mean, the woman who had black sweat is a good one. Let's just try to think of another example of a really strange. Well, I mean, another good example of that is the 18th century case of the family whose limbs just started falling off.
Yeah.
Developing necrosis, and it's not the very first, but it's one of the first case reports of ergot poisoning. Again, a doctor who encounters a condition that's just inexplicable. These people's limbs just go black and fall off, and it's totally explicable today. We understand what ergot poisoning is. It's almost never encountered, but that is I think, and also I quite like the humanity in that one. That the doctor manifests pity, not just intellectual engagement with what's going on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I found that quite striking as well when I read that story. I'm curious because you've done research clearly, and you've talked about the medical side of these cases, obviously. Have you always been more of a medical writer, or is it just something that you're interested in?
Yeah, no, it's something I've got interested in. I mean, my original interest in all matters medical was cardiac surgery, which I got interested in kind of as a historical story. And when I wrote my book about that, certainly in the UK, there were very few people who were writing about the history of cardiac surgery. There hadn't been a book on the subject in about 50 years. So I got interested in that, partly in terms of the personalities involved, but also I find the mechanics of it, the physiology and underlying it, really interesting. So I got interested through that interest in cardiac surgery, and yeah, it just kind of expanded. I mean, my wife's a doctor, so I'm exposed to quite a lot of medical trivia and stuff as well. At how I mean, I would say that, and I got interested in the history of surgery about 20 years ago. When I was still working at the BBC, I produced a program called In Our Time, which looks at basically the history of ideas, and science is quite a big part of that. So although I don't have a scientific training, I've made lots of programs about particle physics and chemistry, and basic science stuff has always interested me.
Sure. That makes sense. I just have one last question for you before we wrap up the interview, and that's pretty much just taking your book and putting it more in a modern context, as far as if you've come across any sort of modern cases that you would have currently put in that book. I know, clearly we have more modern medicine and we don't treat people with, arsenic-laced cigarettes or anything like that, but I'm just curious if there's anything now that you've come across that kind of falls in that category.
Yeah, I mean, just for practical reasons, the blog that I started before I wrote the book, it ends at about 1900, and that's mainly because if you want to quote, I mean, I think the thing that's really important if you're talking about these cases is to quote the original case reports. They're in some ways they're definitely more interesting than my commentary on them. And so just because you can't reproduce lots of text like that without getting into copyright difficulties, I just cut it off at 1900. But yeah, I mean, there are endless cases. Well, one category of cases that you see a lot in the book is these kind of patients who've done really stupid things to themselves, swallowed something, or managed to get something stuck in an orifice or something like that. And that category of accident mishap is still going on every day in every emergency department in every hospital around the world. And actually, the case reports are a less important part of medical literature than they used to be. They tend to be sort of, I'm sure you're aware of this, but they tend to be kind of sequestered away in specialist journals that are devoted entirely to case histories. But if you look through those, or the journals devoted to emergency care, you will always see some case of somebody who's got swallowed a Lego brick or something. There was a fantastic one. I don't know if you saw this, but there's one about a man who inhaled a plastic traffic cone.
Oh wow!
And it remained in his right bronchus for I think 42 years. So
wow.
So I mean that's a case that's definitely worthy of another another book.
Sure. No, that makes sense. Well, that is all the questions I have for you, Tom. Thank you so much for your time.